So, here we are. So it's day 6, the last full day of retreat. So, how are you feeling? I imagine some people might be feeling, just settling into retreat life, and it's almost time to go. And others might be, I made it, I'm in the home stretch. Or a little of both. That's okay, just be with that feeling. So I'm going to continue the exploration that we've been doing into the Diamond Sutra. And eventually going to talk about chapter 5. But I thought this would be a good point to recap where we've been before I do that. And I think it's particularly important because we've covered chapters 1 through 5, and there are a few commentators who believe that the essential teachings in this sutra are contained in those chapters, and the rest is sort of development and expanding on those themes. So I'd like to take this last opportunity to review what's come before. So in chapter 1, the Buddha sort of models a day in the life of a bodhisattva. He goes into town to beg for his food and sort of taking care of what he needs to do in order to sustain himself and the people that he's responsible for, probably much like many of us do every day. Then he comes back. In the process, he treats everybody sort of equitably, rich and poor. He comes back to wherever he's staying, tidies up, and then gets ready to sit. So he sits down and adjusts his body, and Tensui gave us excellent instruction on how to do just that. And I've been using that since, and it has made a real difference. So thank you. And then he turns his attention to what is before him. In other words, he prepares to do whatever he's going to do mindfully. He's preparing to be mindful. And, that one sentence sums up a real deep practice in and of itself. The Buddha gave us the Sutra on the 4 foundations of mindfulness, which I have a copy of. Actually, I think it's right outside, and it's 14 single spaced pages with the refrain cut out. There's a 10-line refrain after each section, so the actual sutra is actually quite large, and then the rest of this almost inch-thick book is all commentary, much like the Diamond Sutra, and it's just that one writer's commentary. There's back home in the Zendo, we have 2 sets of 7 CDs each by the excellent Vipassana teacher Joseph Goldstein on the Foundations of Mindfulness Sutra. And as wonderful as those talks are, and they are, it's still not exhaustive. So the sutra just kind of tosses that up. The Buddha sat down, arranged his legs, and turned his attention to what was before him. But he gave us a tremendous amount of detailed instruction on how to do just that. And I was thinking about that, and thinking about the Buddha's own journey into awakening. And normally when we think about the Buddha's journey, we think about the beginning, how he was the son of a rich family, kind of living the dream, and then he saw, a sick person, an old person, a renunciate, and a corpse, and these things caused the vocation to arise in him to put an end to suffering. And then if we think about the Buddhist more, then we tend to think of him sitting under the Bodhi tree and achieving awakening. But we don't hear a lot about the part in between. And the part in between, the Buddha, before he was the Buddha, before he was awakened, sampled and tried many of the practices that were extant in his day. Even some of the really severe, extreme renunciate practices, and nearly died in the process. So I think of him sort of going through all that and then having his awakening and being on the other side of that and kind of looking back over his path with all its must have been endless stumbling blocks and dead ends and brick walls. And so here he is on the other side of that, and he gave us all these really organized, almost programmatic ways to approach enlightenment, to think about enlightenment. So he gave us the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path and the Six Perfections and the 12 Steps of Dependent Origination and the Three Defilements and all these kind of packaged, focused methods of directing our attention. These are things that he never had. So as difficult as this practice is, he's made it immeasurably easier for us. And our debt to him is really boundless. So, chapter 1. So in chapter 2, the pretty advanced disciple Subhuti asks his question. How should a bodhisattva stand, walk, and control his thoughts? And Hoju and Tansui give us excellent interpretations of that chapter. And the first part of the Buddha's answer to that comes in chapter 3, and in which is introduced the principle of no self. And Roshi and Tansui talk to that. And the salient point out of that was the bodhisattva will liberate all beings, conceivable and inconceivable, and yet not a single being will be liberated. And Roshi talked to that extensively, and how to view that and how to work with that. So that presents the question: how does one work with no self? How does one work towards the dropping away of self and ego? And that brought us to chapter 4, to the chapter on dana, on generosity. It's not an accident that generosity is the first of the perfections, the first of the practices of perfection. Right? And it functions to break down through giving away our time, our effort, our care, our possessions, just giving whatever we have and whatever the situation requires. This begins to break down the barrier between self and other. And if we do enough of that, we can get to a point where we see that there's nothing to give, and no one to give it, and no one to receive it. So we can see a real structure there. Subhuti asks his question. The Buddha gives the first and possibly the most critical part of the answer, the principle of no self, and then he immediately tells us how to begin working with no self. And that brings us to chapter 5, which Roshi talked to yesterday, and I'm just going to read it again because it's very short. And yet, it's short. It's, let's see, it is 12 or 13 lines. But the question that's posed in it is so important that it's repeated 2 more times in the exact same words in the sutra. It's repeated in chapter 20 and chapter 26. So the chapter goes, "What do you think, Subhuti? Can the Tathagata be seen by means of the possession of attributes? Subhuti replied, no indeed, Bhagavan. The Tathagata cannot be seen by means of the possession of attributes. And why? Bhagavan, the Tathagata says is the possession of attributes is no possession of attributes. This having been said, the Buddha told the Venerable Subhuti, since the possession of attributes is an illusion, Subhuti, and no possession of attributes is no illusion, by means of attributes that are no attributes, the Tathagata can indeed be seen. So, Hiroshi spoke to the various bodies of the Buddha, the Dharmakaya body, the Nirmanakaya, the Sambhogakaya, went into some of the more metaphysical or cosmological aspects of that. But I'm glad she did, because I'm not sure I'm up to that. But I'm going to focus a little bit more on the emptiness aspect in this sutra. The other thing about chapter 5, it's the beginning. It introduces that dialectic that we see in the rest of the chapter, where A is A is not A, therefore A is A. And we see that sort of structure repeated. We see our notions of logic, of like the principle of identity, being violated again and again. There's a place where logic and reason break down, and we have to see into this directly. This is the beginning. This chapter marks the beginning of where that starts. So, what does the Buddha mean by that? By no attributes, something cannot be seen by its attributes. So, I'll use my familiar example of the cherry tree out there. That's so beautiful in the spring, and there's nothing about that. There's no aspect of that cherry tree that is inherently cherry tree, that has that identity. You can drill down into that as far as you want, and you will not find anything that you can separate out and say, okay, this thing is cherry tree and just cherry tree. It's not anything else. You can't find such a thing. I mean, if you look at that, if you look at it at a macro level, it's made up of cellulose and water and a few other things, and if you drill into that, into the molecular level, you get whatever molecules involved, and those will break down into atoms, and the atoms break down into whatever, protons and electrons and neutrons, and those break down into quarks and whatever the other particles are in those various families, and those things break down into we don't know what. And there's a level we get to that where, as Roshi mentioned yesterday, the science tells us we get to a level where nothing actually exists, where things exist, as far as we can tell, only as potential, only as Roshi was saying, energy, just flows of energy. Flows of energy in the Dharmakaya. I was listening to a talk on the nature of nothing by a distinguished panel. One of them was John Ellis, who was the principal. He was the principal writer of the paper on how to discover the Higgs boson, which was the theoretical particle that should be present if the Higgs field that was theorized does really exist, and that's what the theory says should give matter to particles like the electron. If that doesn't exist, then we've got to throw all the theory out the window. So this guy is the heavy-duty physicist, and he calls that place where things just become virtual, he calls this the quantum vacuum. So he says quantum vacuum, we say Dharmakaya. He says virtual particles, we say energy flows. I think it's all the same thing, or the same non-thing, you know. But at that place where, and the interesting thing he said about that, which I found particularly interesting, was that theory would indicate that those virtual particles, everything that exists as matter is virtual, exists virtually in the vacuum, and all that virtual stuff was not created in the Big Bang. So that, to me, as a Buddhist, he's talking about the birthless, and that implies the deathless. So there's this tremendous parallel between what's going on in these really fundamental sciences and the Buddha's insight of 2,500 years ago. It's really remarkable how congruent the Buddha's insight was with what is, his internal experiential insight is with what is now being verified externally and communicably. And this is so much the case. I was reading another interesting article by the Dalai Lama about his experience at a 2-day discussion with Anton Zellinger, who's the head of the Quantum Institute in Vienna, and another writer who tries to forget his name, Art Zajac. And they were trying to discuss ways to think about and to understand this relative and absolute predicament we find ourselves in. And out of that came a book of discussions between the Dalai Lama on and they're trying to find common methodologies that could, that where Buddhism could help physics and physics could help Buddhism. It was really interesting. I won't go into it here, but just to make the point that this is not, what the Buddha is talking about. It's not just some sort of metaphor. It's reality. It's the nature of reality. And the nature of reality is that there's a point where our normal way of thinking about things, where reason and language and logic break down. They're simply not operable anymore. They are out of the bounds of what they apply to. So the general conclusion out of that is that the cherry tree has no independent, permanent identity, and in that sense is not real. It's empty. Everything about it is not unique to it. Is not has no identity, as I said, that it's just cherry tree. And in the Complete Enlightenment Sutra, the Buddha uses his own body as an example of this. I'll just read it because it's so eloquent. So the Buddha says, keep this thought in mind. This body of mine is a combination of the 4 elements. Its hair, nails, teeth, skin, flesh, muscles, bone, and marrow belong to earth. Its saliva, tears, pus, blood, snot, froth, phlegm, semen, urine, and feces belong to water. Its warmth belongs to fire, and its movement and stillness belong to wind. Take away each of these 4 elements, and this body turns out to be an illusion. Where is it now? So this is all embodied in the Heart Sutra that we just chanted, right? And I'll just repeat a shorter version of it. When Avalokiteshvara Bodhisattva penetrated the Prajnaparamita, the perfection of wisdom, she saw that the five skandhas, form, sensation, perception, volition, and cognition, the constituents of what passed for the individual, are empty, and she freed herself of all sufferings and obstructions. Shariputra, form is no other than emptiness, and emptiness is no other than form. Form is emptiness, and emptiness is form. Sensation, perception, volition, and cognition are also like this. I hope as we chant the Heart Sutra, we can see into this. So what is it that keeps us from seeing this? Self. And that was the central problem that the Buddha talked about in chapter 2, in chapter 3. That's why it's in chapter 3. It's the first of the answers to Subhuti's question. This notion of a separate, independent self. The Buddha just told us there is nothing that has there's nothing we can point to that has a separate, independent identity as itself. And yet things exist, right? So we have these two perspectives of the relative and of the absolute when we can see it. And our error is that we give inordinate emphasis to the relative. We take this bag of skin and bones and whatever he said, snot, pus, everything else, and all its attributes, hair color, eye color, and all the thoughts that occur to it, and all the feelings that occur to it, and the biases and attitudes and opinions and beliefs and all that stuff, and I say, that's me. And in light of what the Buddha just told us, it's so incredibly limited. It's so limited. We're so much vaster than that. And that fundamental overemphasis is what gives rise to our suffering, because it gives rise to the three defilements. It gives rise to ignorance, greed, and anger, or delusion, desire, and aversion. And really, it's delusion that gives rise to the other two. If we weren't deluded about who we are, we would see that there's nothing to desire and nothing to be averse to. So what can we do about that? Well, the Buddha gave us that answer too, and he gave us the practices of the six perfections and the practices of mindfulness. And in chapter 4, he told Subhuti about dana, about generosity, and that is not an accident. It's not an accident that those first 5 chapters are structured exactly that way. It really contains all of practice in those 5 chapters. So we start with dana, generosity, and then we have the other 5 perfections: sila, ethical conduct; kshanti, patience or forbearance. That's what Roshi was just talking about in the Dharma Holder Empowerment Ceremony. Virya, energy or strength; diligence; dhyana, and concentration, and self-reflection; and prajna, wisdom, which is what the Diamond Sutra is about. It's the perfection of wisdom. Prajna paramita. So how does this notion of emptiness work in our lives? So I've used this example before, and I think for the same reason. It's a personal one, and I don't know, it just resonates me when I read this chapter. And that's when I was in social work training, had to do an internship at the outpatient of a psychiatric unit of a hospital in Jersey City, and there were like 20 of us interns. It was a madhouse of interns, and one of the other students in the program was a guy about my age. He was also changing careers, and he was a husband and father. And one day he was assigned a patient who had a history of molesting children. And at our weekly group meeting, he came in just really kind of beside himself, and he said, "I don't think I can work with this person. You know, I don't want him to get better. I don't want him to feel better. In fact, I want to take him up behind the building and beat the living shit out of him. That's really what I want to do." And, we processed that in group, and he eventually, came to remember that sort of compulsion is just that. It's a compulsion, and it's not the kind of thing where a normal or relatively healthy individual wakes up one morning and decides that molesting a child would be a good idea to do today. This person was never a well-adjusted, healthy individual, and probably had some child trauma at a very early age, and probably by a parent, and that parents probably had something similar happen to them, because this kind of thing is transmitted transgenerationally. But the point is that without knowing the details behind that, if my friend could have seen into the Buddha nature of this person that he was assigned to work with, then he would have seen that this person was not just the body in front of him, but it was everything that ever went into him. It was his culture. It was where he grew up. It was how he grew up. It was all the conditions that went into creating him, which really is every event that ever happened in the universe. And if we can think like that, then we can think wisely and compassionately about what to do. Now, this person is dangerous to children. There's no disputing that. And children have to be protected from him. So limits need to be set on his freedom to do those things. But we can do that for that reason, for the protection of children, rather than for vengeance or applying any kind of violence, because it just it doesn't help. And we see that. The United States has the highest rate of incarceration in the world, and it's really a punitive system. It's not anyway. So if we could see that way, then maybe we could make wiser decisions about how to handle these problems in our lives, and not act out of reactivity that Roshi was talking about yesterday. We are outraged when these things happen to children, and rightfully so. But we need to see into them in order to make wise decisions about what to do about that. So the second example I want to give you is one that was also touched on yesterday, and that's that it's political season in America. And so I challenge you to think about whether you can see the Buddha nature of the, let's take the presidential election, can we see the Buddha nature of the two candidates? Even the one you're not supporting, whoever that might be. Now it's day 6 of retreat. So that might be a little easier had I asked this question on day 2, the answers might be a little different. So I'm going to suggest to you that come this coming Sunday, check in with yourself, if you remember, about how you're feeling about that. And try to notice the difference between how you're feeling then and how you're feeling about now. And the difference is selfing. It really is. Okay, so just again, chapter 5 presents the teaching of emptiness, in which all entities are seen as dependent in time and space on other entities, and thus empty of any nature of their own, and hence they are not of themselves real. Okay. Now also in the chapter, the Buddha, Subhuti is a senior monk. He has heard this before. He understands this. So the Buddha challenges him to go beyond that, to go beyond thinking about emptiness, to go beyond emptiness as a concept and see it directly, to see it, to be the Dharmakaya, to be one with everything that he encounters. So, just I'll read a few quotes about this. So Huineng says, ordinary people only see the physical body. They do not see the Dharma body. Thus they cannot practice charity without focusing on appearances. They cannot practice equanimity in all places, and they cannot respect all beings. Those who see the Dharma body can practice charity without focusing on appearances. They can respect all beings, and they can cultivate the perfection of wisdom. So that brings me to, that's the conclusion of chapter 5 of the Dhamma Sutra. And it brings me to, I want to say a few words about this matter of becoming a Dharma holder. So, first of all, when Roshi mentioned this to me, I realized that despite having hung around the Zendo for so long, I didn't really know what that term meant. It's an odd term, if you think about it, Dharma holder. The Dharma is empty, right? What is this Dharma that I am holding? So, but I knew it was a step in the process of transmission. So, like any good monk, I Googled Zen transmission. And I was astonished by this multiplicity of opinions that I saw about this whole issue of transmission. I was really, it's fascinating, really, and there's so much of it. So I mentioned this to Roshi, but there's so much confusion and such variety of opinions about the meaning of transmission. And in true Roshi fashion, she said something like, "Yeah, but it means something." And then she went back to whatever she was doing. So thank you for that. That was really helpful. And I suspect the answer to that, for me, will keep developing. But I think right now it means a couple things. And one is that the experience of insight is available to anyone at any time. It can and has happened to people out of the blue. And we have had people attached to the Sangha in one form or another who have had those kinds of experiences. And when they occur to the unprepared mind, they are just as, if not more likely, to be disruptive, really seriously disruptive to people's lives as they are to be beneficial. And so I think, although, as Roshi said, the Dhamma holder you want to take this from another direction. So, in one of the koans I was just working on, Koan Yamada Roshi gives the function of a Zen teacher as someone who achieves some insight and achieves some peace, and transmits that method to others, communicates that method to others, and that's true. So there are things to be taught. There are techniques to be taught. There are forms to be taught. There are sutras to be taught. But enlightenment itself cannot be taught. It just can't. So I think those other things that can be taught would probably not require the depth and length of training that goes into growing a Zen teacher. That's a 10 to 20 year project, and so the teacher functions also as a guide, as to help people with those experiences and with other experiences, the little snags that can occur in practice. We can get hung up on ego, or resistance by intellectualization, or life issues. Life issues happen to people and keep them from practice or keep them from insight. So the major part of the teacher's job is to guide people through these difficulties, and that requires a lot of experience with working with people very intimately. And we are blessed to have Roshi, because she is just peerless at this. But, and I don't have to tell any of you that. And that's why this training needs to be so long. The teacher needs to be really steeped in that sort of work for a long time, kind of like aging fine wine. You need to be aged for a good long time before they're sort of uncorked on the world. So, and I think people benefit from that. I think people benefit from having that kind of deep training, that kind of deep experience. So it's necessary for people like me and like Tensui to have an excellent teacher, someone who's been through the same process herself. But it's also necessary that we have an excellent community, a community to work with, a community of people who are committed, who are hardworking, most importantly, who are willing to share, to open their minds and hearts to people like me, so that we can work together. And so none of what's happening today would be possible without each and every one of you. So thank you all. Sentient beings are numberless. I vow to free